Stephen King movies. Has there ever been an author whose film adaptations have yielded such mixed results? It's kind of expected to a degree. With so much output combined with Hollywood's enthusiasm for adapting practically every King story available, they're not all going to be winners. In fact, some are true losers, banished to cinema anonymity forever. But there's one movie that's so odd in its connection to Stephen King that it sits apart from all the rest on its own bizarre shelf. An outcast of sorts, in that it has been disowned by the author who wants nothing to do with it. Considering some of the other movies that bear his name, that's really saying something. Of course, we're talking about the wacky virtual reality obsessed The Lawnmower Man, which was once upon a time known as Stephen King's The Lawnmower Man. But the author's displeasure with it was so great that he put a stop to all that. That story, and several more, will be told here. So strap on your VR helmet and get ready to dive into a cyber world cheesier than you could ever possibly imagine. Because we're going to find out just what the f happened to the Lawnmower Man. Let's start at the beginning, which in this case is 1975. About a year after the first printing of Stephen King's debut novel, Carrie, the men's magazine Cavalier publishes a succinct yet warped short story from the author called The Lawnmower Man, about a man named Harold who hires a brand new landscaping service, Pastoral Greenery. Harold soon finds out that the grotesque man he's hired has the disturbing habit of following the lawnmower, which is apparently sentient, and eating the grass that it clips. The mower even runs over a helpless mole intentionally. Harold doesn't have much time to freak out about this, however, because the lawnmower chases him throughout his own living room, eventually killing him. Turns out Harold's death is a sacrifice for the Greek god Pan. Poor Harold never knew what hit him, and neither did readers, for this story is as weird as it is funny. A couple years later, The Lawnmower Man was published in King's short story collection, Night Shift. A well-known producer of British horror movies named Milton Subotsky acquired the rights to 6 of the Night Shift stories, with the intent on making anthologies similar to the ones he'd produced in England, like Tales from the Crypt. This never worked out though, and soon the rights to some of these stories were up for grabs again. The Lawnmower Man was snatched up by a production company called Allied Vision, which evidently saw the potential for a feature film. But how do you make a feature film out of a story that's not only incredibly bizarre, but also so very short? And how in the world does it evolve, or devolve rather, into a movie about a simple-minded gardener who becomes a ruthless 8-bit god with the help of virtual reality? In Hollywood, anything is possible, kids. Now we pivot to the man truly responsible for this oddity, Brett Leonard. In 1989, Leonard and his partner Jamel Everett impressed people with a low-budget horror item they've concocted called The Dead Pit, about an evil doctor back from the dead tormenting a mental hospital. Leonard eventually crosses paths with the folks from Allied Vision who were trying to get the Lawnmower Man off the ground. Their initial idea was about expanding the short story into one about a serial killer who used a lawnmower to kill his victims. Whether or not that movie would have been preferable to the one that we got is ultimately up for you to debate. But we can all probably agree that it still feels like a pretty thin concept for a movie. Leonard wasn't excited about the prospect of making a serial killer movie, but he did propose a different angle, albeit a radically different one. Leonard had found himself increasingly fascinated by a new technology called virtual reality. He'd seen a computer scientist named Jaron Lanier give a speech about it and immediately thought it was the next big thing. Problem was, no one really knew what virtual reality was. Leonard and his partner had to craft an educational video for the producers and distributors just to get them caught up on what VR meant and where it could be headed. Leonard was eventually able to convince Allied Vision to lend the title and King's name to an idea dealing with this abstract world. He and his partner had written a script called Cyber God that would eventually become the basis for the Lawnmower Man movie. As a compromise, there would be one scene in the film where a lawnmower kills a guy on its own, and that guy's name is Harold Parkett, just like in the story, and the similarities end there. To be fair, the movie does indeed have a Lawnmower Man, though he's nothing like the overweight nudist from the story. His name is Job. He lives at the local church and does handyman work around town. Job has some kind of mental disability and gets a lot of hate tossed his way from various local bullies. But he's a good-hearted soul with a childlike innocence. Obviously, he's the perfect person to test out experimental mind-altering technology on. Tech that's coveted by a shadowy agency that's looking to use it as a military weapon. Everything should proceed as expected, and it's really shocking when it all goes straight to VR hell. The film was originally budgeted at a measly $1.5 million, a figure that jumped to $5.5 million when it was all said and done. Some sources even say that it went as high as $10 million. Though it was truly an independent film, Paramount Pictures was interested in picking it up and distributing it. They eventually jumped ship, but not before suggesting Jeff Fahey play the lead role of Job. Paramount was apparently very enthusiastic about Fahey in a horror thriller of theirs called Body Parts, and they were convinced that he was on the verge of becoming a big movie star. 2 days before shooting began, Fahey surprised everyone by showing up with his hair dyed completely orange, thinking it would help give the character an extra quirk. The producers were surprised, to say the least, and convinced the actor to dye it blonde, which looked slightly less ridiculous on camera. With Fahey aboard, the time came to cast the well-meaning, but let's face it, hopelessly naive scientist Dr. Angelo. Pierce Brosnan was looking for a leading man role since the end of his TV show, Remington Steele, and was a few years away from getting his most coveted part, James Bond. Leonard felt Brosnan was a movie star, even though he was primarily known for being a TV lead, and Brosnan took the part on. Leonard would later joke that it was impossible to make Brosnan look bad on camera for scenes where he needed to be stressed out or in bad shape. He was just too damn good looking. On the technical side of things, there were a couple of future superstars in their respective crafts. The cinematographer was Russell Carpenter, then a reliable director of photography of low-budget action and horror flicks, now best known as the guy who shot True Lies, Titanic, for which he won an Oscar, and the recent Avatar: The Way of Water. According to Leonard, James Cameron himself was actually a fan of the Lawnmower Man, and liked the way that it looked so much he ended up hiring Carpenter for True Lies, and the rest is history. The production designer was Alex McDowell, who'd worked with David Fincher on a couple of Madonna videos, and that was it. In the years since, he's been the production designer of The Crow, Fight Club, Minority Report, and Man of Steel. So never accuse the Lawnmower Man of not having a significant place in cinematic history. So immersed in this VR world were Leonard and Everett that they envisioned a deluge of Lawnmower Man related VR games flooding the market following the release of the movie, which obviously did not come to pass. There was, however, a video game released for Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, and I know some of you remember that game. After Paramount had dropped out of distributing the movie, New Line Cinema, back then still primarily associated with Freddy movies, jumped aboard. That changed things dramatically for the picture, as its initial cut was a rather bloated 2 hours and 20 minutes long. This cut featured an extended opening starring a chimp, who was the unlucky test subject of Dr. Angelo's, and his brief friendship with Job, as well as a lot of scenes that enhanced character development. The head of New Line, Bob Shea, wanted all of the unnecessary character and dialogue stuff removed, reportedly telling Leonard, "Don't cut effects, cut conversation." The film went from 140 minutes to 108, though that would certainly not be the last we heard from the extended cut. Early in 1992, New Line held a screening in Torrance, California for The Lawnmower Man, and reactions were not kind. New Line was understandably let down and started considering a direct-to-video release, a death sentence at the time. Leonard convinced them to open in a handful of markets for a weekend with minimal advertising just to see how it performed. His gambit paid off, the film doing well enough in less than 5 theaters to change the studio's mind and prompt them to give it a true theatrical release. Speaking of screenings, one interested party gave the film's director the scare of his life one afternoon. As Leonard tells it, he received a phone call from none other than Stephen King himself, who told him he was about to see the film for the first time. Leonard then waited an agonizing 2 hours before hearing back from the guy who drafted the story in the first place. According to Leonard, King called back and raved about the film, specifically mentioning that his kids had enjoyed it. As an aside, King had said something to the effect of course it has nothing to do with my story, so I'm probably going to sue those bastards, but I won't sue you, so don't worry about it. Great job." Leonard felt relieved. Stephen King's The Lawnmower Man opened the first weekend of March 1992 and did pretty well for itself, coming in at number 2 with $7.7 million. The film went on to gross $32 million domestically, making it New Line's number 1 film of the year, as well as the most successful indie of '92. A sequel, Job's War, was released a few years later and was considerably less successful. True to his words, Stephen King did sue those bastards, sorry folks at New Line Cinema, for using his name without permission. King made it clear that it had nothing to do with money, but integrity. He argued that his name shouldn't be anywhere near the film or its marketing materials because he himself had nothing to do with it. In an interview with the LA Times, he said, "My name is my fortune, and it's the only name I've got." In the same interview, he was sure to mention that he thought the movie was pretty good. For their part, New Line argued that it wasn't their decision to change the story. They were simply distributors who picked up an already existing product. Bob Shea even noted that they paid for the film because of King's name being associated, saying his name was the most important thing that they were buying. And up until the movie's release, they hadn't heard a peep from King or his people. King succeeded in his lawsuit and was awarded $2.5 million in damages, in addition to halting the studio from using his name in conjunction with the film. But the drama didn't end there. 2 years later, King sued once again after discovering home video copies of The Lawnmower Man still carried his name. He'd hired private detectives in several different cities just to check. Once again, he won his lawsuit and forced the studio to pay him profits that they'd made off the film for approximately 1 year. To this day, when you watch the film with commentary or the featurette on the Blu-ray, they still can't mention King's name, with one person even referring to him as the name above the title. "Come at the King you best not miss," as a great man once said. For the curious, there are at least 2 far more faithful adaptations of The Lawnmower Man out there. One is courtesy of Marvel Comics, with some pretty nifty art from the legendary Walt Simonson. The other is a 12-minute short film made in 1987 that can be found online. It's rough around the edges, to say the least. Eventually, Leonard's preferred director's cut was released on home video and cable, presumably giving fans of the theatrical cut a major shock to the system. It was by all measures a success, and for a time it was the only version available on video or TV. Now, thanks to Scream Factory, you can see both versions. And say what you want about the effects, the film is frequently intriguing and compelling, thanks to Fahey and Brosnan's performances, and some fairly clever ideas sprinkled throughout. No, it's not King, but it's not as easy to dismiss as some other King adaptations either. If nothing else, it can be seen as a very amusing time capsule. And virtual reality is still with us, so hand it to Leonard, he was onto something all those years ago before anyone even knew what he was talking about. And the man still does work in the world of VR to this day. Let's just hope the chimps have been kept out of it.